What disturbs me more than the policy that you call a policy is the rationale for the policy. The rationale for the policy. You set out 4 principles that you adhere to, and then and I will go over them in a moment. Then you say on page 14, we must not become part of South Africa's problem. We must remain part of their solution. We must not aim to impose ourselves, our solutions, our favorites in South Africa. Damn it, we have favorites in South Africa. The favorites in South Africa are the people who are being repressed by that ugly white regime. We have favorites. Our loyalty is not to South Africa, it's to South Africans. And the South Africans are majority black, and they are being excoriated. It is not to some stupid puppet government over there. It is not to the Afrikaneers regime. We have no loyalty to them. We have no loyalty to South Africa, to South Africans. And the fact of the matter is I listen to this rationale, first of all. It is the leaders of South Africa and their people, black and white, who have the majority responsibility. They must rise to it. Well, they are rising to it. They're rising to it. The only thing left available to do with that repulsive, repugnant regime of Afrikaners there. And it's the only way they have. They've tried everything for the last 20 years. They begged, they borrowed, they crawled, and now they're taking up arms. The second thing, progress toward peace requires a timetable. Timetable, elimination of apartheid. What's our timetable? What are we saying to that repugnant regime? Are we saying you've got 20 days, 20 months, 20 years? We ask them to put up a timetable. What's our timetable? These people are being crushed. And we're sitting here with the same kind of rhetoric. The same thing we heard. We heard go slow. We heard we have to take care of the problem afterwards. We heard we can't impose.
You are totally misconstruing the testimony that I gave.
Read first.
Furthermore, Senator, let me say that I hate to hear a senator of the United States calling for violence.
I'm not calling for violence.
That's what you're doing.
I hate to hear
exactly what you're doing.
I hate to hear an administration and a Secretary of State refusing to act on a morally abhorrent point. I hate to hear this country. I'm ashamed that this country puts out a policy like this that says nothing. Nothing.
In 1986, then Senator Joe Biden delivered an impassioned speech condemning apartheid in South Africa and challenging the U.S. administration's reluctance to take decisive action. His speech was not merely a political statement. It was a moral outcry against the racial oppression and systemic injustice that plagued black South Africans under the apartheid regime. The broader implications of this speech extend far beyond the South African context, resonating deeply with black and colored communities worldwide. This analysis explores the significance of Biden's address, analyzing its impact on racial discourse, international policy, and the continuing struggles of marginalized populations. The power of direct condemnation. Biden's speech stood out because of its uncompromising language. Unlike the U.S. administration's measured diplomatic stance, Biden spoke with moral clarity. By calling the South African government a repugnant regime and rejecting neutrality in the face of apartheid, he affirmed a fundamental truth: systemic oppression must be actively opposed, not passively tolerated. This direct condemnation was particularly significant for black and colored communities, as it underscored the necessity of vocal advocacy in the face of racial injustice. For black South Africans, Biden's words validated their struggle. The apartheid system, which had subjected them to decades of land dispossession, economic marginalization, and political exclusion, was not merely an internal issue. It was a global crisis demanding international intervention. His rhetoric helped bring global attention to the moral imperative of dismantling apartheid, reinforcing the idea that racial justice is a universal concern, not a localized struggle. The U.S. and the politics of racial struggle. Biden's speech also shed light on the broader role of the United States in racial conflicts. At the time, the Reagan administration was reluctant to impose strict sanctions on South Africa, arguing for constructive engagement. This position mirrored historical patterns in U.S. domestic policy, where systemic racism was often met with incrementalism rather than bold action. For black Americans, this mirrored their own civil rights struggles. Just as black South Africans face state-sponsored racial oppression, African Americans had long battled segregation, voter suppression, and police violence. Biden's speech implicitly linked these struggles, illustrating how racial justice movements, whether in Pretoria or Birmingham, were bound by a common resistance to white supremacy. The U.S. government's hesitancy to act decisively against apartheid was a painful reminder that the fight for racial equality required persistent, organized pressure from within and beyond oppressed communities. The global significance for black and colored majorities. Beyond the immediate South African context, Biden's speech carried profound implications for black and colored majorities worldwide. The apartheid regime was not an isolated case, but a reflection of a larger colonial and racial hierarchy that had shaped global politics for centuries. By explicitly naming the victims of apartheid black South Africans and rejecting the idea that the U.S. should remain neutral, Biden acknowledged a historical truth. Black and colored populations have consistently been placed at the bottom of social hierarchies, and their liberation requires more than empty rhetoric. For diasporic black communities, particularly in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Europe, Biden's words reinforce the importance of international solidarity. Many post-colonial nations still grappled with the lingering effects of European imperialism, from economic underdevelopment to racial discrimination. His speech underscored the necessity of confronting racial injustice wherever it appeared, whether in South Africa, the United States, or the Global South. The timetable for liberation and its ongoing relevance. One of Biden's most critical points was his demand for a clear timetable to end apartheid. He questioned why the U.S. government refused to impose a concrete deadline for change, emphasizing that oppressed peoples had already waited too long for justice. This argument remains highly relevant today, as black and colored communities worldwide continue to fight for racial and economic equity. In the modern era, systemic racism persists in various forms, from police brutality and mass incarceration in the United States to economic exclusion and political disenfranchisement in post-apartheid South Africa. The call for a definitive timetable remains unanswered in many respects. While legal apartheid ended in 1994, economic apartheid continues, with vast racial wealth gaps and structural inequalities defining the lives of many black South Africans. Similarly, in the U.S., while the civil rights movement achieved legislative victories, systemic racism remains deeply embedded in institutions. Biden's speech reminds us that liberation must not be an indefinite, gradual process dictated by those in power. It must be driven by urgent, transformative action, something black and colored communities continue to demand globally. Lessons for contemporary movements. Biden's words in 1986 serve as an instructive blueprint for contemporary racial justice movements, from Black Lives Matter in the U.S. to student protests in South Africa. His passionate critique of political complacency is a call to action for activists today, urging them to challenge lukewarm responses to racial injustice and demand tangible reforms. One of the most enduring lessons from his speech is that neutrality in the face of oppression is complicity. The idea that governments and institutions should remain impartial while racial minorities suffer is a dangerous one. Biden's rejection of this stance is particularly relevant in today's geopolitical climate, where racial injustices, whether in Palestine, Haiti, or Brazil, demand active global responses. His speech exemplifies the kind of moral leadership that is often lacking among contemporary policymakers. Conclusion: Joe Biden's 1986 speech on apartheid was more than a condemnation of a single oppressive regime. It was a powerful articulation of the global black struggle for justice. It recognized the inherent moral responsibility of powerful nations to stand unequivocally against racial oppression and emphasized the need for urgent action rather than passive observation. For black and colored majorities, the speech remains a historical touchstone that validates their fight for justice and serves as a reminder that liberation is not granted but fought for. As racial justice movements continue to evolve, Biden's words should serve as both a warning and an inspiration, a warning against political complacency and an inspiration for those who continue to demand that the world's leaders take an unyielding stand against systemic racism. The implications of his speech: clear true justice requires more than speeches. It requires unwavering action, solidarity, and an uncompromising demand for immediate change. His speech also challenges us to reflect on the role of political rhetoric in shaping policy. Words have power, but they must be backed by action. As we analyze Biden's speech today, we must ask, how far has the US truly come in aligning its foreign and domestic policies with its stated values? And how can we, as individuals, push our leaders to uphold the principles of justice and equality? If you found this analysis insightful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Our discussions on political history, social justice, and global affairs aim to shed light on the forces shaping our world. Your engagement helps keep these important conversations alive, ensuring that historical lessons are not forgotten, but actively applied in our fight for a better future.